good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to Stroud Book Festival 2020, wherever you're joining us from. My name's Caroline Sanderson, and I'm Artistic Director of the festival. Now, I often wish that we didn't have such opposing words as fiction and non-fiction to categorise books, because, myself included, many of us read and enjoy both. So at our festival, it's always fun to programme events that unite these two genres under one banner, weaving and melding them together. And that's what we'll attempt to do this afternoon in this Travelling Hopefully event with Rachel Joyce and Raynor Winn. Rachel Joyce, who lives here in Gloucestershire, is the author of novels and short stories, including The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, Perfect, and The Music Shop. Her latest novel is Miss Benson's Beetle, which we'll mostly be talking about today. Raynor Winn is the author of The Salt Path, which charted the epic walk around the southwest coast path, which she and her husband Moth embarked upon after they were made homeless. She relates what happens next in her latest book, The Wild Silence. So welcome both of you to Stroud Book Festival. And I just want to say before we start that we'll be taking questions a bit later, so please do put those, type those into the chat function on YouTube. So welcome, Rachel. I think this was actually your idea to do an event with Raynor, sort of, wasn't it?
I think it was on my wish list, yes.
And here you are. Your wish is our command, yeah. Yes.
Well, Raynor's book was, I think, the first book I was actually able to read during lockdown. I was lucky enough to have an early copy. And I love The Salt Path, but I really love this. And it really spoke to me. And I just thought, we both obviously have an interest in what happens when you step out of the front door, but also what happens when you can't. So, yes, it seemed like a perfect opportunity to speak together.
Yes, definitely. I think there's... So the title, Travelling Hopefully, it's a slightly random one, I think. But the idea of journeying and of quest and, yes, the importance of stepping out of the front door, but also of forward movement in our lives. It seems to be a theme that's very much common to both these books, different though they are. And I think, Raynor, the Salt Path was definitely a sort of kind of pilgrimage, a journey that you embarked on not for pleasure, but as so many of our journeys are embarked on a pleasure, but for a bid for sort of sanity and survival, really.
I think so. I think it was. It was a search for hope. I think a search for possibility, and so in a way you could call it a pilgrimage. But just like Rachel's book, I think in a way her characters leave home more in hope than in certainty, and I think that's what most journeys are, aren't they? I think that's what a lot of the journeys that really change our lives. That's what they are.
And of course, we might unpick that word pilgrimage a bit more later, because it's a word that conjures up sort of certain things, isn't it? But of course, it's a word that you used in the title of Harold Fry, Rachel. And now we have Miss Benson on a rather harebrained quest, which we'll find out a bit more about it. But it's the quest almost as a catalyst for affecting change in our lives as well.
Yes.
Good.
The quest is. I mean, the search for something is always interesting, and in the fact that sometimes you can think that you're looking for one thing, but actually what you're really searching for is something that's much more hidden to you, and maybe much more difficult to attain than the wild thing that you think you're going after in the first place.
Yeah.
But as a structure, for a storyteller, the quest is a great structure anyway, I think, because you just have such an obvious objective, and it stands to reason that if you really want to find something, there are going to be a lot of problems along the way.
Yes, and well, it's a very ancient story structure, of course. Thinking of Homer and the Odyssey and so on. I mean, it's you see it all the time. So let's delve a bit deeper into these wonderful books and see what common themes we can draw out of them. So, Rachel, why don't you introduce your heroine, Miss Benson, and explain a little bit about this quest that we've been talking about?
Yes, so Miss Benson's Beetle is the story of essentially of Margery Benson, who's a middle-aged woman. This is 1950, who's led a pretty hidden life and a pretty kind of, I mean, one of those, the life that I think a lot of my so-called aunts lived when I was a child and some of my teachers, where they're kind of expected to be quiet, I think, and sort of dress in brown and not really step into the light. And then Margery has always had this passion since she was a child for a beetle, to find a golden beetle. But this golden beetle is the other side of the world on a tiny island called New Caledonia. And suddenly she has one of those kind of crises, I would say, in life, where it's as if her will to survive or her will to live is actually stronger than the kind of mediocre existence that she's kind of pedaling along with. And suddenly she just breaks free and decides to go to the other side of the world in search of this tiny golden beetle. But the only thing that she needs is an assistant. And that's kind of where the adventure begins, because, of course, she ends up with the last woman on the planet she would want to be with.
Yes, and I think I'd like to talk about travelling companions in a minute. Do you want to just because this golden beetle has all through the years where she's, as you say, dressing in brown and is kind of a bit downtrodden, quite anonymous. She's a teacher and very unhappy where she's teaching. Would you like to read us a bit which just explains this idea of the golden beetle and how it's sort of always stayed with her, from quite a young age? It's sort of always been lodged in her brain, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, if I read the opening, then I'm kind of not giving anything away to anybody, and we're all in the same boat. But this is the moment where Margery first finds out about the golden beetle, and it's set in 1914. When she's 10. When Margery was 10, she fell in love with a beetle. It was a bright summer's day and all the windows of the rectory were open. She had an idea about sailing her wooden animals across the floor 2 by 2, but the set had belonged to her brothers once, and most of them were either coloured in or broken. Some were even missing altogether. She was wondering if in the circumstances you could pair a 3-legged camel and a bird with spots, when her father came out of his study. "Do you have a moment, old girl?" he said. "There's something I want to show you." So she put down the camel and the bird, and she followed him. She would have stood on her head if he'd asked. Her father went to his desk. He sat there, nodding and smiling. She could tell he didn't have a proper reason for calling her. He just wanted her to be with him for a while. Since her 4 brothers had left for war, he often called her, or she'd find him loitering at the foot of the stairs, searching for something without seeming to know what it was. His eyes were the kindest in the world, and the bald top of his head gave him a naked look like an egg. "I think I have something that might interest you, old girl," he said. "Nothing much, but maybe you will like it." At this point, he would normally produce something he'd found in the garden, but instead he opened a book called Incredible Creatures. It looked important, like the Bible or an encyclopedia, and there was a general smell of old things, but that could well have been him. Margery stood at his side, trying hard not to fidget. The first page was a painted illustration of a man. He had a normal face and normal arms, but where his legs should have been, a green mermaid tail. She was amazed. The next picture was just as strange, a squirrel like one in the garden, but this had wings. And it went on, page after page, one incredible creature after another. "Well, well, look," her father kept saying. "Well, now, goodness me, look at this chap, Margery." "Are they real?" she said. "They might be." "Are they in a zoo?" "Oh, no, dear heart. If these creatures live, they've not been found. There are people who believe they exist, but they haven't caught them yet, so they can't prove it." She had no idea what he was talking about. Until that moment, she'd assumed everything in the world was already found. It had never occurred to her things might happen in reverse, that you could see a picture of something in a book, that you could as good as imagine it, and then go off and look. Her father showed her the Himalayan yeti, the Loch Ness monster, the Patagonian giant sloth. There was the Irish elk with antlers as big as wings, the South African quagga, which started as a zebra until it just ran out of stripes and became a horse. the great auk, the lion-tailed monkey, the Queensland tiger. So many incredible extra creatures in the world, and nobody had found a single one of them. Do you think they're real? She said. Her father nodded. I have begun to feel comforted, he said, by the thought of all we do not know, which is nearly everything. With that upside-down piece of wisdom, he turned another page. Ah, he pointed at a speck, a beetle. Well, how nothing this was, how small and ordinary. She couldn't see what it was doing in a book of incredible creatures, never mind whether it was not yet found. It was the sort of thing she would tread on and not notice. He told her the head of a beetle was called the head, the middle was the thorax, and the bottom half was the abdomen. Beetles had 2 pairs of wings. Did she know that? One delicate set that did the actual flying, and another hardened pair to protect the first. There were more kinds of beetle on God's earth than any other species, and they were each unique in remarkable ways. It looks a bit plain, she said. Margery had heard her aunts call her plain, not her brothers, though. They were handsome as horses. Ah, but look. He turned to the next page, and her insides gave a lurch. Here the beetle was again, magnified about 20 times, and she had been wrong. She had been so wrong she could hardly believe her eyes. Close up, that small plain thing was not plain, not one bit. Oval in shape, gold all over. It was incandescent. Gold head, gold thorax, gold abdomen. Even its tiny legs were gold, as if nature had taken a bit of jewellery and made an insect instead. It was infinitely more glorious than a man with a tail. The golden beetle of New Caledonia, said her father. Imagine how it would be to find this one and bring it home.
Thank you so much. Now, Raynor, I'm tempted to ask you if you saw any green mermaids on your on your walk around the coast of southwest England. But Rachel touched a little bit earlier on the fact that Margery gains a travelling companion, a most unsuitable travelling companion, who's interestingly called intrepidly. But one of the things in the wild silence that we found out more about is the Moth as your travelling companion and the travels that you embark on, you know, in your early years together as well. And that's something I very much enjoyed in the wild silence. So it's the sort of, in a way, it's the progression through your lives of these journeys you've been on together.
I think he's always been my travelling companion, you know, even before the Salt Path. I think all the journeys that we took in our younger years together got really built our connection, not just to each other, but to the natural world, were facts that I wanted to include in the wild silence, because they illustrated that connection that I was trying to describe, but also because your travelling companions, they change you as much as the journey changes you. You evolve with them and with the journey. And I think I wanted to show that evolution between us before we even set foot on the Salt Path, that journey that we had taken through those years together, and how we started that journey. I'd been just a teenager, and I'd never been to the mountains. I'd never been to the wild places in this country, but those were the places that really drew Moth in. And I went with him. I would have gone anywhere with him in those days. I would have jumped through any hoop he set for me to jump through. So we went to some wild and ridiculous places in this country and found ourselves in all sorts of strange adventures and scrapes, sleeping on the side of a mountain in the middle of an incredible storm where our tent got ripped away, and we spent the night in a plastic survival bag on the side of a mountain in this most intense storm, and other wild adventures that we had. But we evolved from those very early days together through that time spent, you know, in plastic bags on hillsides, to be the people that we were at the beginning of the Salt Path. And without those early journeys, then that later journey may not have been possible, because we had become the people that we were then because of the early journeys that we took together. And I think travelling companions change your journey. The right companion, the wrong companion, can change the whole aspect of that journey. As with Rachel's Margery and Enid, they seemed like the absolute worst companions. But by the time you come to the end of that book, you realise that they were absolutely perfect for each other in ways you couldn't have imagined. And so at the start of the Salt Path, two people that had been together for a long time, starting out on a journey in such traumatic circumstances, you think, nope, they're not going to make it. But those journeys influence you, change you in ways you couldn't possibly imagine when you set out.
Yes, and without giving any spoilers, in Miss Benson's Beetle, it's this the unsuitability of these travelling companions is sort of what brings about change in their lives, isn't it? So it's really fascinating, and it struck me as, you may not have seen Green Mermaids, but there is definitely that sense of the almost mythological sort of significance of, as we were saying before, of what it means to go on a journey and with someone else as well, and almost in search of an idea, perhaps, this idea of a beetle that may or may not exist, or the idea that somehow by moving as you did in the Salt Path, you'll find some peace or some meaning or something. Now in the Wild Silence, what we also get is, of course, what I should say is that in the Wild Silence you've come to rest. Actually, you're not mostly you're in one place, and the book is a lot about I suppose getting used to that after being on the move, isn't it?
It is, yes. It starts where the Salt Path ended, and we're trying to adjust back into normal life. And you think it would be perfect because we've moved into a house, we've got a roof, everything should be ideal. But I find it really hard, really difficult to adjust. I can't sleep, I'm constantly agitated. And then I put the tent up in the bedroom, and I sleep in the tent, and suddenly life starts to make more sense. Everything starts to feel easier. And ridiculous as it is, after weeks of sleeping in the tent in the bedroom, suddenly there was a start to realise that actually it wasn't perfect being back in a house, and that the journey doesn't always have the conclusion that you think it should. And sometimes where you think you're ending a journey, you're actually just beginning one. And the physical journey had ended, but I was just embarking on a huge emotional journey then that would take me through experiences that I didn't ever think that I would have. And then into another physical journey. But I think there's so much expectation that a journey ends. You go back home, you close the door, and life carries on perfectly. Whereas actually, I don't think our journeys ever really end. I think they link one into the next. And as I said, the Wild Silence is an emotional journey, but just as unpredictable and full of green mermaids as the Salt Path.
Rachel, you're so when we think of your heroine, Margery Benson, she goes right to the other side of the world, to an utterly different place. Is that, and I'm starting to talk now, I think, about the importance of wildness, of we've got the Wild Silence, the importance of being close to nature, but also in quite a not pretty nature, but in quite a wild and quite sort of unsettling way almost sometimes. Was that part of the reason why you chose to take her to a very different place, the other side of the world?
I did it for a number of reasons. One was that I knew I wanted to write a book about a female friendship, but that I felt that I could explore it best by putting my two women on a journey, but also in quite extreme conditions. The other thing was that I felt, as a woman, I kind of had begun to feel I couldn't see why I wasn't making women the centre just the center of my books. Why I wasn't writing exclusively for women. So I also wanted to write a kind of female adventure in the style of all those kind of male adventure stories. I kind of basically wanted that genre for women. And so I thought this has got to be it's got to be an adventure that not the women have never been on, but also for me as a writer, I've got to go out of what I'm comfortable with. Because I think there can come a point where, as a writer, where you feel you're kind of slightly not doing what you've done before, but you're not pushing yourself. And then I think the writing can become tired. So I did want to take myself away from everything I knew. And also because it is an adventure story, I thought the reader has to be taken away from everything they know. So this has got to feel, in order to kind of get the right energy, everything I knew had to go. So that was really the reason for putting them in this really wild landscape and this, it's unkind landscape. But equally, it's incredibly beautiful. It's big and it's everything they don't know. But I think, that was kind of the drive behind it. And there was also one moment when I was researching beetles, which obviously I had to do a lot of research into. And somebody said to me, the thing about insects is that they are known unknowns, by which they mean that we know that there's a lot of insects we don't know. And it felt that felt like the whole kind of drive behind the book. It was a kind of adventure into something we half know, but we don't know. And it's that for the women. It was that for me. And I hope it's that for the reader too.
Mm. And I love the yes, very much. It's an action adventure. I love this idea of maybe exposing yourself to the elements as a writer, taking yourself out of a comfort zone. I feel like, Raynor, you've got so many stories in The Wild Silence about exposure to the elements, but it's almost, what's the word I want? It almost produces... It produces interesting change while you're doing it. It's not just the calm out of the storm, but yes. And I was also very struck in your book, Raynor, about you touch on it in The Salt Path, that it's the strenuous exercise, and yes, this sort of exposing yourself to the elements that's actually physically helped. It's physically helped Moth as well, hasn't it? With the help to arrest the decline from the neurodegenerative condition that he has. Do you want to say something about that? Because you expand on that in The Wild Silence, this feeling that you have to get out there and you have to really push yourself.
Yeah. Well, when we were on the Salt Path, just in the way Rachel was talking about putting yourself outside your comfort zone, then on this, when we were on the Salt Path, absolutely in every way, we were outside our comfort zone, because we'd taken away our home, the whole structure of our lives, and then Moth was diagnosed with that neurodegenerative disease. So everything in our lives was outside of normal, outside of the framework of life, and all we had to sort of like draw on was that connection to nature that we'd built up between ourselves through all those years together and all those experiences we'd had. And there was something happening on that walk that we couldn't identify, we couldn't say why, or we couldn't say how, but Moth's health was starting to improve. After hundreds of miles of walking, he was physically starting to change in ways we'd been told were utterly impossible. And I wanted to explore that when I started to write The Wild Silence. I started to write it and realised that all I was writing was a what comes next, and that it wasn't what I wanted to write. So I had to put it aside, and then I came back to it months later, because I'd realised that what I wanted to do was explore that natural connection to the natural world, and how that had affected Moth's health, and how it had actually been the thing that we'd drawn strength from during that time and going on. So when I came to write The Wild Silence, again, as Rachel was saying, I felt actually I was putting myself outside what was comfortable, outside what was familiar, because I'd written The Salt Path, my first book, and it had been sort of linear. It had gone forwards along the same shape that the path had taken. It had followed that, and it had followed our physical journey. But as I started to try to explore those connections to the natural world and how that can drive you into taking the most unusual decisions and routes that you might not have planned through life, I realised that actually emotionally that's what we were doing after the wild silence. I was trying to get back into normal life, but that life wasn't ever going to be normal again. There was never going to be that kind of normality again. And actually, the new life we were going forwards into was so emotionally different to anything we'd experienced before that it was like an adventure in itself, and it would throw up all the strange and unusual experiences, and also with that so many possibilities. But through all of that, it was our connection to the wild places and to the wilderness and the green spaces that were affecting Moth's health and that we were drawing strength from. And so it was that connection that sort of was shining the light on how to go forwards for us.
Yeah. And I think you actually uncovered, and this is so interesting. I mean, I think the benefits of being outdoors are well documented for our mental health, perhaps, and physical health, of course. But you do start to uncover some actual evidence for that in the wild silence, which is really, really interesting. I found it fascinating.
Well, absolutely fascinating to find that actually we all know that being out in green spaces is good for our mental health, that it helps us feel more at ease, more relaxed. But to find that actually there's a scientific reason for that, I found it absolutely fascinating. That plants emit chemicals that they call secondary metabolites, that they emit these chemicals to protect the plant, to ward off pests and all sorts of other reasons why they emit them. But to find that our bodies actually physically, metabolically interact with those chemicals emitted from plants, it's sort of it threw a whole other light on ideas such as forest bathing. That actually we think we're just going into a pleasant green space and it's making us feel relaxed. Actually, there's something far deeper than that, something almost primeval, something that we're carrying forwards with us from a far more primal state of actually physically interacting with the natural world. And that opens up so many ideas about how we actually need the natural world. We don't live alongside it. We don't live alongside it as observers, but we are actually part of it, part of that whole huge green organism that is the planet. And that we are influenced by every shift in that space, every shift in the climate, as much as the birds in the hedgerows. I found that absolutely fascinating when I discovered that as I was writing.
Oh, me too. I'm going to explore one more sort of thing that I think is a common idea, and then perhaps we'll take some audience questions. I think both your books invite us to feel compassion for those on the margins because of the harsh blows that life has dealt them. Rachel, we see this in your heroine, whose early life is very scarred by tragedy. We won't say what, but and then she leads this very sort of, I guess, quiet and slightly downtrodden existence for a long time. I think you do seem to have a bit of a penchant for characters who might be said to have been kind of bypassed by life.
Yes, I do. I think that's where my sympathy naturally lies. People who might consider themselves outsiders. I mean, either because they, don't know how to function the way that a lot of people seem to function. I mean, maybe what I'm really talking about is introverts, because especially during this year, I think I've become even more of an introvert than I was before. But Margery is a true introvert, and I think introverts can be very bad at being extrovert, and they can kind of really overshoot it and get it really, really wrong. And I am always, those people move me, I think, because there is courage there. There is loneliness, there is frustration at not being seen. And there's just not, I don't know, not being part of the kind of busy, loud world. Those people are just the people I'm naturally drawn to. They would be the people I would watch if I'm, somewhere where there are people. That I work in a sort of caravan looking over a field, and I often see people walking alone. And that state of solitude, loneliness, I think more solitude, really, it does pull me in. Mm. Whereas seeing loud people, I always feel, well, you're fine. You don't need me to kind of watch you. You're watching yourself.
Raynor, that makes me think about the word silence, because actually one of the other things we discover that you write about in this book is you as a child, a very shy, introverted child, and look what's happened to you in recent times. I mean, you're here talking to us. You've done many book festivals. You spent a lot of time recently talking about yourself. I wouldn't say that you spent a lot of time being loud, but you have. It's this whole thing has been that given, almost just as Rachel's heroines transformed. It's a sort of been a transformative thing for you, hasn't it? Actually.
It absolutely has. I mean, I've always been a very introverted, very, very isolated sort of person. I think especially as a child, as I've written about, a very, very shy, very withdrawn almost child. So to take myself along this incredible journey with the book that has meant talking to so many people in so many different places has been. You could call it an adventure, you could call it an experience, but it's certainly been transformative, that's for sure. And not necessarily just because I've been there in the limelight, but I think because it has thrown me into situations where I've had to interact with other people. And then when you're in those scenarios of talking to people that you may never ever have spoken to people like that before, it can change the way you feel about so many different aspects of yourself. And I think like a journey can transform you. And the experiences along the way when you're forced out of your comfort zone transform you entirely. And I met so many people that actually I think are the same. There are so many people who actually live their lives within their own little bubble and find that their lives have been actually quite small, maybe because of that, but quite intense at the same time. But I think it was the people that I met in signing queues after the events, after these many public events, that really started to change things for me. I think the sense of hearing everybody's stories, hearing their stories of how they interacted with my book, how they had maybe gone through points in their lives where everything had fallen apart for financial, emotional, health reasons, and how they had turned to nature, had turned to just being outside, and how that had given them solace, almost as if it's something instinctive within many of us to actually turn to the natural world when we need something that we can't put our finger on. And I think just listening to all those stories started to make me feel that actually we're all the same. In so many levels, we all share the same emotions, the same fears and frailties. And I think learning, sort of discovering that, sort of led me through a sort of barrier then, I think, to actually being more open with people and maybe a little less of the introvert I'd always been.
Actually, that's a perfect time to read that little bit that we talked about earlier, which is because this notion of sharing stories on the final day of a book festival feels, so very appropriate.
Yeah, shared stories, they are what connect us, I think. The first letters came when The Salt Path had been out in hardback for a few months, but after its release in paperback, they began to come every week. Letters from people whose lives had taken a wrong turn and fallen apart, people who'd lost homes, families and businesses. Letters from the sick and dying, people struggling with disease whose fears were not for themselves, but for their families and how they would cope. And from the families trying to cope without their loved ones. But all of them holding out hands full of care and concern for Moth in a mass exhalation of hope. Each letter I opened held words of compassion and empathy, offers of help and homes. I breathed all of them in, each envelope adding a layer of restored belief. But this letter was different. Invitations to speak at events were coming thick and fast. More stages to be sat on and audiences to be faced. Fear gripped me every time the lights shone in my face and the first question was asked. But in the queues that formed after the talks, queues of people waiting to have their book signed, there was no fear, just stories. Stories of lives lived, loves lost, and walks that changed beliefs. But something else was happening in the queues, not for those waiting patiently with their copy of the book, but for me. As I signed my name again and again among the birds that flew through the end papers, the shared stories joined mine in a unity of hope. Fear, trauma, and pain, feelings as unfathomable as humanity, as old as the hills we'd walked on, part of the complexity of existence, but feelings that united us all into a collective hand, gently moving the sofa away from the wall and lifting a small girl out into the light.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Now, well, so maybe we should face some audience questions now. I'm sorry we can't have a signing queue, but next time we'll have a long signing queue for you both. Rachel, Tessa would like to know, what's the longest, wildest, maddest journey you've ever undertaken?
Oh, that's such a good question. People ask these questions and you think, can you just come back next week and I'll have worked it out? I think this is why I'm a writer, because I just don't know the answers to things unless I really reflect. But I would say that the wildest adventures I've been on must have been imaginative ones. My imagination, I have a freedom in my imaginative life that I feel I don't have anywhere else. And I think it's sometimes a frightening thing, but definitely that's more powerful than anything else I've experienced, honestly. And I think this is why creativity is a kind of vent for creativity is so very important, because the imagination is a marvelous, wonderful thing. We all have them, but it can also be a very destructive thing. And so I feel lucky that I have a creative vent for it, and I would wish the same for anyone else.
That's a very good answer, in my view, as we talk about stories. Raynor, Denise would like to know, how did publishing your first book change your process of writing? Now, this is a very interesting question because we learn a bit in The Wild Silence about how you wrote The Salt Path and how you came to write it.
Yes, writing The Salt Path, it was a completely unpressurized experience, because there was no expectation in me that I was ever going to write a book, I was ever going to complete it. There was no expectation from anyone else about deadlines or what I might produce, because nobody actually knew I was writing a book. So it was a completely relaxed and easy process of just me, the paper, and the guidebook that we'd used for the Salt Path, for the Southwest Coast Path. And that's where that book came from. But then when I came to write The Wild Silence, it was in completely different experience, because by then the Salt Path had sold quite a few copies, so there was a sort of weight of expectation from the readers, but also from the publishers who'd asked me to write another book. So a different experience entirely. And like I said earlier, I started to write The Wild Silence simply as a what comes next, after the Salt Path. And I realised that if I was going to write something else, that it wasn't going to be just that. It had to be something much more than that, something that really explored something deeper than that. So I had to put it away and not write for quite a few months, until it got to a point where it was April, I think, of last year, and I was supposed to be handing it in September, and I hadn't written anything because I'd just binned everything that I'd written. And then suddenly I found the shape to it, because I realised that I hadn't just got to go forwards, I'd got to go back as well. I got to go back into my earlier life, my childhood and the early days with Moth, to try to explain what it was I was taking forwards. And so then it became a completely different experience of writing the past as well as the present. Very different shape to the Salt Path.
I can see that. Rachel, can novelists be said to find out things about themselves when they write their books?
Oh, I hope so. I think if we don't, we're not doing it properly. I think, yes, I would say with Miss Benson's Beetle, for instance, I decided before I wrote the book that it was going to be, in fact, I slightly boasted to my editor, it was going to be a very quiet, beautiful, short book, really tender. And then I began to write the thing. And I don't believe that you just let the characters kind of do what they want to do and you follow them. I don't, that's not how I really view my writing. But at the same time, I think you have to just be open to the fact that things will come into your imagination, as I was saying earlier, that you just didn't see coming when you sat down at your desk. And with Margery and Enid, what I thought was going to be quiet just turned into this kind of explosive, I would say extrovert book. And that's simply to do with the two women that I put together. I didn't foresee that at all. So, even though my ego perhaps said it was going to be one thing, creatively, it was not it just couldn't be that. And it did really affect me, the energy of the two women. I found myself feeling, I think it affected the writing, but it affected my attitude to the writing, in that as Raynor was saying earlier, I kind of came to a point where I thought, I don't really mind what anybody thinks of this. I mean, this is what I have to write. This is what I'm finding. And I found that lesson in itself very liberating, because if you have written a book and then another book, there is a weight of expectation that can become confining, and also you can become quite fearful, and you kind of so it was very good for me to realize I could throw all that off and just go in a new direction. And that was partly, again, why I had to go to I had to just go out of everything, away from everything I knew. So I learned a lot.
I love the way that you describe the book taking on a completely different energy. It's almost like you are creating a chemical reaction. You put Margery with Enid, and and this is brilliant, actually, because one of the things that bits in The Wild Silence that I read this passage over and over again, and I could not stop thinking about it. And this, Raynor, is where you introduce quantum physics into your book. Now, this, everyone's going to be going, what? But I think there's an elemental sense to what you've just been describing, which is Rachel, and in the Salt Path, I think, let me see if I can find it. It's yes, here we go. So you're talking about when there's a vacuum. And the vacuum, I suppose, in your context, Rachel, could be the empty page before you start writing. And then you say, Raynor, even in a vacuum, it's possible for the energy to change almost without warning. And what you're talking about, Raynor, there, I think, is the fact that in your life you can be in this terribly difficult situation that you cannot see how you're going to get out of it. But But if you sort of almost lay yourself open to the possibilities, so as the novelist, you're kind of resigning yourself and saying, right, well, let's just see what happens. And it's is it too fanciful for me to say? It was almost a bit like that, this vacuum. Is that what you were talking about? Let's just see and there's so many serendipities in your life, yours and Moth's lives, that have happened, it seems to me, because you've just laid yourself open to, what will be, bring it on.
Yes, I think so. I think that's what I was trying to explain, was that sense of when there's just like nothing. And I think we were really in a point of there being nothing in our lives, nothing in my life. Moth had gone to university, but I was just in a, it felt like a vacuum. It felt like there was just nothing happening in my life. But the idea that if there is nothing, but you stay open to possibility, that there can be a change of energy, there can be a change, and from that something can be created. It's the same as Margery and Enid. It seems like the most unlikely thing, but suddenly a spark comes from that, and from that a whole world of adventure can spiral away. And I think that's the wonderful thing that we've taken from life, I think, since walking that coast path, was that sense of leaving everything behind, and then all that's left is hope and possibility. And I think that's the way I've tried to go forwards.
Yeah. So that could be said, where we talk about travelling, hopefully, that could be what we mean.
Yes, I think so. I think to travel with an open mind, and to travel with nothing other than hope, can lead you down the most unexpected, but often the most important paths of your life, I think.
Rachel, travelling hopefully as the novelist.
Yeah, I think as a novelist you always have a little bit of hope, because otherwise you just couldn't do it. I think you have that curious, it always strikes me as this little flame of self-belief that you must nurture, you must, because nobody else can do that for you. But it's going to be battered all the time by yourself, a lot of the time, by your own insecurities or whatever it is that, you carry with you. But writing novels always, I feel, whenever I'm writing about a journey, I think actually I'm writing about writing fiction, because it seems to me it is exactly traveling hopefully. It is not abandoning your sense of, it comes up in Miss Benson's Beetle, but your vocation, the thing that you need to be true to, and that is hope. But that is also, I think we often know the answers in ourselves, but we don't know how to access them. And to think that somebody else can do it for us is not good. And so, again, traveling hopefully is exactly that.
Oh, I think I feel like we have to end there. That's such a wonderful note on which to finish. It's been such a delight talking to you. I wasn't entirely sure quite where we'd go with this, but I think we've arrived somewhere rather wonderful, haven't we, on this final day of the festival, talking about books? Thank you both so very much for joining us. It really has been such a pleasure, and I hope that everybody watching has got some hope is a big word at the moment, and I hope they've got even more buoyed by watching you both. So thank you again. A reminder that you can buy Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce and The Wild Silence by Raynor Winn from our festival booksellers Stroud Bookshop, stroudbookshop.com. We urge you to buy it from them or another independent bookseller at this very difficult time for independent retailers. If you'd enjoyed this event and you'd like to support Stroud Book Festival, perhaps by donating what you might have paid for a ticket today, details of how to do this are on our website, stroudbookfestival.org.uk. Now, coming up at 6:00 on our Stroud Book Festival YouTube, a real treat, as Ellen Cormack and I will be in conversation with Dara McAnulty, winner of this year's Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing, about his remarkable book, Diary of a Young Naturalist. And also tonight at 7:30, Stroud Short Stories presents readings of 10 stories on the theme of disruption. For information on joining this event, please see the Stroud Book Festival website, stroudbookfestival.org.uk. See you soon.